The vessel unbroken theorem dropped out of superluminal transit at precisely the coordinates specified in the mission brief, and for a long moment none of the 6 scientists aboard said anything at all. They didn't need to. The thing was simply there, filling the forward observation array with a presence so enormous and so wrong-feeling that the ship's orientation systems briefly misclassified it as a gravitational anomaly and began calculating an emergency course correction before Dr. Vossarindel overrode the automation with sharp click of 2 of her secondary manipulators. "Hold position," she said. "All stop. Let the sensors breathe." The unbroken theorem obliged, settling into a slow drift at a distance of 400,000 kilometers from the object. At this range, the thing filled approximately 30 degrees of visible arc when viewed to the forward array. It was not, as the initial probe data had suggested, and then violently retracted, a rogue planet. It was not a dense gas body. It was not a cold stellar remnant of any catalog variety. The probe's original classification had lasted 11 days before the biological sensor suite had returned its readings, and those readings had detonated 3 careers with the quiet precision of a shaped charge. Dr. Vossarindel was Kathrani. She stood, if standing was the right word for what a Kathrani did, which it wasn't really, but it was the closest translation that worked across the mission-shared language protocols. At the primary observation console, her 6 lower limbs arranged in the wide, flat posture her species adopted when processing something genuinely unexpected, her upper body. The part that most other species found easiest to look at was oriented toward the forward array. Her coloration had shifted from its usual working amber to a deep mottled violet that meant, in Kathrani chromatic language, "Something like this changes the frame of everything I thought I knew." She was a mission commander, appointed by the Galactic Institute of Ancient Studies specifically because the Kathrani were known across 800 years of interspecies scholarship for keeping their composure when composure was the hardest thing to keep. She was keeping it, but only just. Behind her, arranged around the observation ring in their respective environmental accommodation pods, the other 5 members of the expedition were having their own private confrontations with what lay ahead. Researcher Palavar, the Devesi representative, was perfectly still in a way that was unusual even for Devesi, who were by nature a slow and deliberate species. The Devesi had evolved on a world of dense, ammoniated atmosphere and crushing pressure, and their bodies reflected this. Squat, dense, heavily armored in layered carapace that ranged in color from deep ochre to near black depending on age and status. Palavar was old, by Devesi reckoning, old enough that the outermost layer of his carapace had developed a faint iridescent sheen that his people called the second skin of time. He was a theologian as much as a scientist. The Galactic Institute had not initially wanted a theologian on this mission, but the Devesi Cultural Compact had insisted that any investigation of a being this ancient required someone trained in the contemplative disciplines, and after 6 months of bureaucratic correspondence the Institute had relented. Palavar had said almost nothing during the 3-week transit from the nearest inhabited system. He had spent most of his time in a meditative posture that looked, to anyone unfamiliar with Devesi behavior, like sleep. He was not sleeping. He was preparing for what exactly he had not specified, even when asked directly. Now, staring at the thing on the forward array, the iridescent sheen of his carapace pulsed once, briefly, with a light that had no name in Devesi chromatic vocabulary because it had never been needed before. Across the ring from him, taking up considerably more space than any other single occupant, was Skethevarian the Long-Tide, who preferred to be called Sketh for the convenience of colleagues whose mouths were not built for the full phonemic range of Vari nomenclature. Sketh was Vari, and the Vari were, by a significant margin, the largest sapient species currently known to interstellar civilization. They were also among the most mathematically gifted, a fact they were entirely too aware of and frequently mentioned. Sketh's body occupied the large frame accommodation pod in the aft port section of the observation ring, a flowing, partially translucent mass of organized biological material that shifted and restructured itself continuously, the way a slow river reshapes its own banks over years and decades. The Vari had no fixed morphology. They had a fixed mind. Their cognitive substrate was a distributed network that persisted regardless of what physical shape they happened to be expressing at any given moment, but their body was a perpetual work of improvisation. Currently, Sketh was expressing a shape that was approximately ovoid with several extended sensor mass protrusions oriented toward the forward array, which in Vari body language meant intense focus analysis. The deep luminescent pulses moving through Sketh's translucent outer membrane were moving in a rapid, irregular rhythm that indicated something the Vari called a sensation of a proof you cannot yet write, but know must exist. Sketh had been the one, during the pre-mission briefings, who had done the most precise mathematical work on the age-dating data. The dating had been performed by 6 independent methods and cross-checked against 17 different isotopic and quantum decay baselines. The result was the same each time. The being was older than the current universe. It predated the last cosmological reset by a margin so large that expressing it in any conventional unit of time produced numbers that looked like typographical errors. Sketh had spent the entire transit not in meditation, like on Palavar, but in increasingly frantic mathematical work, trying to find an error in the dating methodology. There was no error. Sketh had eventually stopped looking and had instead started writing what appeared to be, from the fragments visible to colleagues who happened to glance at the shared notation board, an entirely new theoretical framework for understanding what age meant when applied to a thing that had outlived not just stars but the geometry of space itself. The notation board was currently full. Sketh had started a second one, in the environmental pod adjacent to Sketh's, behind a carefully maintained pressure membrane that kept the interior at roughly twice the atmospheric density of the rest of the ship, sat, or rather, crouched, in the specific posture her species used when in close proximity to something they regarded as dangerous, Dr. Renya Kassen 4 dimensions. She was plethora. The plethora were small, fast, and possessed a sensory suite so acute that they had, at various points in their cultural history, been accused by neighboring civilizations of being telepathic. They were not telepathic. They were simply very, very good at reading electromagnetic signatures, microvibrations, chemical gradients, and the 17 other sensory channels that their biology provided them with, and they processed this information fast enough that by the time a plethora scientist told you something, she had usually already processed more raw data about the situation than most other species could manage in a week. Renya was young by plethora standards, which meant she was approximately 40 standard years old, and still moving with the slightly too fast energy of a person who had not yet fully learned to slow herself down to the pace of the universe around her. She had been recruited specifically because of her work in what the plethora called deep pattern reading, the discipline of finding signal structures in apparently random environmental data. If the being communicated in any way that fell within the range of detectable physical phenomena, Renya was the one most likely to notice it first. She was currently noticing something that she hadn't yet decided how to report. The 5th scientist was Instructor Davathuel, 9th holder of the chair of Comparative Exobiology at the Meridian Institute on Torval Station, which was a title so unwieldy that everyone on the mission simply called him Davith. He was Torvalian, which meant he was tall, bilaterally symmetrical in the standard configuration, covered in fine sensory cilia that extended and retracted in response to environmental conditions, and possessed of a deep, resonant voice that came from a secondary vocal apparatus his species had developed for long-distance communication before they had invented any other kind. The Torva aliens were the most widely distributed sapient species in the known galaxy, primarily because they were relentlessly, almost pathologically, curious about other life forms. Davith had spent 60 years cataloging the biology of 1,700 different species, and had published what was generally considered the definitive reference text on the biochemistry of life in reducing atmosphere environments. He had, by his own count, personally encountered more different forms of life than any other living scientist in the Institute's membership. He had, until 400,000 kilometers ago, believed he had seen enough variation in living systems to be unsurprisable. He was staring at the forward array with the expression of someone whose entire professional foundation had just been gently removed from beneath them, and what replaced it was not emptiness, but something stranger, a giddy, terrifying sense of infinite depth. The 6th and final member of the team was someone who had almost not come at all. Veil thin among echoes. Veil, for the same convenience of nomenclature that had simplified Sketh's name, was Ossiari. The Ossiari were, in the estimation of most other species, extremely difficult to understand, which was ironic given that they were the galaxy's foremost specialists in communication theory. The Ossiari had evolved in an environment where direct sensory contact between individuals was impossible. Their home world was a dense, completely lightless ocean world, where every individual existed in near total isolation from every other, separated by pressure gradients, temperature barriers, and chemical walls. They had developed language not as a tool for sharing, but as a form of reaching, a way of bridging the unbridgeable. Every Ossiari was by instinct and training a communication theorist who understood at a cellular level that the deepest problem of consciousness was not what to think, but how to make another mind know that you exist. Vale was here because if contact was to be attempted, if the being ahead of them was to be spoken to, in any sense that the word spoken could stretch to cover, then Vale was the one most likely to find a way to begin. Vale was currently doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. The Ossiari expressed their deepest cognitive states in ways invisible to other species. Internally, Vale was running through the entire theoretical literature on contact protocols for non-standard intelligences and finding that approximately none of it was adequate for the situation, and that this was somehow exactly what Vale had expected, and that the path forward was therefore to set all aside and start from the most basic principle of all. You reach toward the other thing, and you wait, and you pay very close attention to what reaches back. Initial sensor sweep is complete, Dr. Vossarindel said, her voice carrying the deliberate evenness of a commander who is choosing her tone with surgical care. I'm putting the full data package on the shared display. All primary researchers, please review and note observations in your own disciplines. We will have a joint analysis session in 4 hours. She paused, and the pause was not empty. It was the kind of pause that contained a great deal that was being consciously held back. Take your time. Read everything. There is no hurry. We are not going anywhere, and neither is it. The data package opened across the shared display, like a wound in the known world. What the sensors showed was this: the being, and it was a being. The biological readings were clear and consistent and unambiguous in a way that only the most deeply unsettling data ever was. Occupied a volume of space approximately equivalent to the volume of a small, dense moon. Its outer surface, if surface was the right word, was not a clean boundary. It was a gradation, a zone where the being's biological processes became increasingly concentrated as you moved inward, until at the core the density of organized biological material reached levels that the probe sensors had needed 3 independent verification cycles to accept as real. The outer gradation extended for several hundred kilometers in every direction, thinning gradually into surrounding vacuum. The surface, the zone of highest biological activity, was not uniform. It had texture, at scales ranging from the microscopic to the macroscopic. At the largest scale, there were what the probe's imaging system had tentatively labeled structural formations, massive, slow-moving arrangements of dense biological material that rose and fell and shifted over periods of time measured in decades, not days. The probe had been in place for 6 months, and in that time the structural formations had changed position in ways that were unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably directed, and entirely unexplainable by any known biological model of locomotion. At intermediate scales, the surface was covered in what appeared to be vast networks of interconnected channels and chambers, through which something, some fluid, some organized medium, moved in slow, rhythmic pulses. The pulses are the first sign that the probe's initial classification as a rogue planet was wrong. Rogue planets did not pulse. The rhythm was not simple. It was not a heartbeat exactly, because the Torvalian concept of a heartbeat implied a centralized pump, and there was no centralized anything visible in the probe's data. But the rhythm was consistent, and it was repeated across thousands of different channel networks simultaneously, and the repetitions were not independent. They were synchronized in complex, interlocking patterns that the Vari mathematician on the Institute's analysis team had described, before she too had lost her position to the data's implications, as the most elaborate standing wave structure ever recorded in biological material. At the smallest scale the probe could image, the surface was covered in what appeared to be dense, organized molecular structures of extraordinary complexity. Not cells exactly, not anything resembling the cellular architecture of any known biology, but organized units of biological material, each one performing what appeared to be coordinated chemical work, each one connected to its neighbors by structures so fine that the probe's imaging resolution was insufficient to resolve them clearly. The Institute's biochemistry team had spent 4 months on this data and produced a report that began with the phrase, "We cannot account for the thermodynamic basis of these structures," and declined from there. The heat and light were the data points that, in combination, made the age-dating results impossible to ignore. The being generated both internally. The heat was substantial, not stellar scale, but far more than any body of this mass should be capable of generating through known biological metabolism. The light was not distributed uniformly. It emerged from specific points on the surface in patterns that varied over time, and the variations were not random. They were repeated. The patterns recurred, with variations, in sequences that the probe's signal analysis software had flagged, with agonizing uncertainty, as possibly structured. Possibly structured. The phrase had destroyed careers not because it was a strong claim, but because it was such a careful, qualified, deliberately restrained claim, and still the institutions reviewing the data had found it professionally unacceptable. The age dating was a final piece. Every isotopic, quantum decay, and cosmological baseline that could be applied to the being's material composition returned the same answer through 7 different methodological approaches that made different assumptions and checked different things. The organized biological material in this being had been organized, at minimum, longer than the current universe had existed. The universe was approximately 13.8 billion years old. The being's minimum estimated age was 23 billion years. The maximum estimated age, derived from the most speculative of the dating methods, but still technically defensible under academic standards, was 61 billion years. It had survived the death of at least 1 universe, possibly 3. It was here. It was alive. It was moving slowly. It was repeating patterns. And now, a small ship carrying 6 scientists was sitting 400,000 kilometers away from it, and the scientists were reading sensor data and writing notes and trying to find a professional vocabulary for what they were experiencing, which was, in every case and regardless of species, some version of the understanding that everything they had ever thought about life, time, and the shape of the possible was going to need to be rebuilt from the foundations. The joint analysis session 4 hours later was the most silent meeting any of them had ever attended. Not because no one spoke. They all spoke, in turn, offering their initial disciplinary assessments with a careful professionalism that years of training had built into them. But between each statement, there were pauses that stretched like the distances between stars, pauses in which 6 minds from 6 different biological architectures were all doing the same thing, sitting with the weight of something too large to yet hold comfortably. Davis spoke first, because he was a biologist, and this was, at its most fundamental, a biological discovery. He laid out his initial observations in careful, organized sequence. The being's metabolic indicators were unmistakable. Whatever process was generating the heat and the rhythmic fluid movements through those channel networks was, by every functional definition of the word, alive. It was not alive in any way that matched the models he had spent 60 years building. Its biology appeared to be organized at a molecular scale below the cellular threshold. It had, as far as the sensor data could show, no cells. What it had instead was something Davis was tentatively calling substrate-level organization, a form of biological complexity that operated directly at the molecular level without the intermediate organizational layer that every other known biology used. This was, he said, in a voice of carefully maintained calm, approximately as surprising as discovering that a building could stand up without any structural framework, using only the intrinsic properties of its material to maintain its shape. It should not, by any known physical chemistry, be possible. He noted this. He moved on. Skef went next, and the mathematical analysis was precise and terrifying in its clarity. The age-dating data was sound. Every methodological objection Skef had attempted during the transit had failed. The being was older than the current universe. The mathematical implications of this, Skef said, flowing slowly into a configuration that expressed grave, careful authority, were not merely biological. They were cosmological. For this being to have survived a universal reset, the reset could not have been a true thermodynamic death, because nothing biological could survive a true thermodynamic death. Either the reset had been partial, a reorganization rather than an ending, or the being possessed some mechanism for existing outside normal space-time during the period reset and re-emerging afterward. The second option required mechanisms that current physics could not describe. The first option required a revision of cosmological models that would take decades to work through properly. Sketh had already started. Palavar spoke third, and what he said surprised everyone except Vale, who had expected it. He did not offer a scientific analysis. He offered a description of a concept that existed in Devesi contemplative tradition, one of the oldest traditions in the known galaxy, dating back for 1,000 years to the first Devesi who had looked up at their thick ammonia sky and asked what lay beyond. The concept was called Vorimidal, which translated, imperfectly, as the witness that preceded the first word. In the Devesi contemplative literature, Vorimidal referred to a hypothetical state of pure existence that predated any other thing. Not a creator, not a god, but something more fundamental, a presence that simply was. Before anything else had yet managed to be, the theological literature on Vorimidal was approximately 3,000 years old and had been regarded, during those 3,000 years, as a beautiful but purely philosophical exercise. Palavar said, in the deliberate, slow cadence of someone who was choosing every word with the care of a being who understood that what was said in this room in the next several hours might be the most significant speech any of them ever made, that he was no longer certain the literature was purely philosophical. There was a very long pause after this. Renya spoke forth, and she brought the meeting back to Data with the specific urgency of someone who had been sitting on an observation and needed to release it. She had detected, during the initial sensor sweep, something that she had not included in her written notes because she was not yet sure how to classify it. The being's outer gradation zone, the diffuse biological material extending outward from the main body, was emitting a low-level signal. It was not electromagnetic radiation in any standard sense. It was not heat, not light, not radio, not any of the emission spectra that biological organisms normally produced. It was a pattern in the quantum-level fluctuations of the vacuum energy in the region surrounding the being, a pattern that should not exist, because quantum vacuum fluctuations were random, and the fluctuations near the being were not random. They were structured. She had 47 hours of data from the probe's quantum sensor suite, and when she ran pattern analysis on it, the structure emerged clearly. She had not published this in her notes because she was still deciding whether the correct professional response was to report it immediately or to spend another week confirming it. The reason she was telling them now was that sitting in this room, listening to Palavar's description of Vorimidal, something had clicked into place, and she needed everyone to know the being was already communicating. It had been communicating for the entire 6 months the probe had been here. It was communicating now. They just hadn't recognized it as communication yet, because no known biology used quantum vacuum fluctuation as a signaling medium, and why would they? Because no known biology could. The silence after this was a different kind of silence than the one after Palavar's statement. That silence had been reverent. This one was electric. Vale spoke fifth. The Asiari voice, transmitted through the ship's communication system rather than directly through air. Asiari vocalization was in the subsonic range and required amplification to be audible to most other species. Was steady and measured, Vale said. The fact that the being was already signaling was expected. Any intelligence of sufficient complexity and sufficient age would have developed some form of environmental signaling long before any interlocutor arrived to receive it. The interesting question was not whether it was communicating, but what the structure of the signal told them about how it thought. Vale had been building a theoretical framework for contact during the transit, and the framework's central premise was that the first step of contact was not transmission, but listening. Not active listening, in the sense of sending a query and awaiting a response, but passive listening, in the sense of understanding the grammar of what was already being said before attempting to speak in return. The quantum vacuum fluctuation signal that Renya had detected was, Vale said, quietly, going to be the most important data set any of them would ever work with. They needed to understand it fully before they attempted anything. And understanding it fully was going to take a very long time, because the time scale on which the being operated, the time scale on which a single thought formed and expressed itself, was based on a cycling period of repeating patterns in the signal, measured not in seconds or minutes, but in something considerably longer. The sixth speaker was Dr. Vasarindal, who had listened to all of this and who now, having heard it, made the first command decision of the mission. They would move closer. They would do it slowly in stages, spending weeks at each new position to allow for sensor calibration and observation before advancing further. They would not attempt active communication until Vale gave the word, and they would each, in their own way and in their own discipline, spend the intervening time working to understand what was in front of them. They were, she said, in the presence of something that had waited for a very long time. It could wait a little longer, and so could they. The first stage brought them to 200,000 kilometers. At this range, the being filled the forward array almost completely, looking at it directly, through the array's filtered imaging rather than the raw visual feed, which was inadvisable because at close range being self-generated light was disorienting in ways that the ship's medical system had difficulty categorizing, was an experience that none of them found easy to describe and all of them found impossible to stop doing. What it looked like was something that had no good analog in the visual vocabulary of any of their cultures, although all of them tried to find one anyway. Dava thought it looked, at the larger scale, like the floor of a vast, slow ocean, not flat but gently undulating, crossed by channels that caught the self-generated light and held it like rivers hold reflections, so that the entire surface was simultaneously dark and luminous. Palavar thought it looked like a landscape of pure memory, something that had been so many things over so much time that all the shapes of everything it had ever been were still faintly present in the texture of what was now a palimpsest of incomprehensible depth. Renya perceived it primarily through the quantum sensor data and saw it as a vast, slowly shifting pattern of structured nothingness, a geometry inscribed not on matter but on the fabric of space itself, using the vacuum as paper and fluctuation as ink. Skef, who was continuously running mathematical models of the large-scale structural formations, saw it as a kind of slow theorem, something working through a very long proof, one step at a time, at a pace that made a star's life cycle look like a brief calculation. Vale simply looked and listened and paid attention to what came back. What came back, at 200,000 kilometers, was different than at 400,000. Renya noticed it first, which was expected, and reported it within minutes of their arrival at the new position. The quantum vacuum signal had changed. Not dramatically, it was still the same basic signal, the same fundamental structure she had identified in the probe data, but there were new elements in it, elements that had not been present in the probe's 47-hour dataset. The new elements were not random. They were precisely the opposite of random. Vale, examining the signal report, said two things. First, that the change in the signal had coincided exactly with their arrival at the new position, and second, that the change was consistent with what, in any known communication system, would be called acknowledgement. Something in the signal had shifted in a way that indicated awareness of a new presence. The being, thinking its immeasurably slow thoughts, had noticed them. The acknowledgement signal was held in the team's shared analysis system for 72 hours before anyone said much about it, because the implications needed time to settle, and because they were all scientists and scientists process things by sitting with data before speaking about it. When they did meet to discuss it, the meeting was different in tone from the first one. The first meeting had been characterized by shock. This one was characterized by something more complex, a mixture of scientific urgency and a kind of careful, species-transcendent, all that none of them had been trained to handle because no training would have been adequate. It had noticed them. It was aware. And it was, as far as Vale's careful 60 standard years of theory in the bones analysis could determine, not alarmed. This was important. A being this ancient, this large, this alone at the edge of everything. What did it feel when something appeared in its vicinity for the first time in, presumably, an almost unimaginable span of time? The answer, based on the signal data, appeared to be curious. The new elements in the quantum vacuum pattern were not defensive. They were not aggressive. They were, Vale said slowly, more like a question than a statement, as if the being had detected something nearby and was adjusting its output in a way that said, not in any language, but in the deeper grammar of pure signal structure, I am aware that something is there. What are you? Vale's response to this was to recommend doing nothing for approximately 3 additional months. There was some resistance to this recommendation, not from Vasarindal, who supported it immediately and completely, not from Palavar, who had the temperament for indefinite patience. Not from David, who was deeply occupied with the biological sensor data and could have spent years on it happily. The resistance came from Renya, who was constitutionally unsuited to passive observation when there was active data to be gathered, and from Sketh, whose mathematical models were producing increasingly interesting results and who felt, with the specific urgency of a mathematician near a breakthrough, that sitting still was costing them something. Vale listened to both of them, and then, in the calm, inexorable way of someone who has spent their entire life learning how to be patient in the face of something enormous and silent, explained why 3 months was a minimum rather than the maximum. The being's signaling cycle, the period over which the repeating patterns in a quantum vacuum fluctuation completed one full iteration, was, based on the data, approximately 4.3 standard years. This was a timescale on which a single unit of meaning in the being's signal structure repeated and resolved. This was not the timescale of a single thought, which might be much longer. It was a timescale of a single beat in the rhythm of a thought. A word, if you wanted to stretch the analogy, was probably closer to 40 years. A sentence was probably measured in centuries. The 3 months Vale was recommending was not enough time to hear even a fragment of a complete idea from a being. It was merely enough time to calibrate their understanding of the signal's basic structure before attempting any response. 3 months was, in the time scale of this conversation, the equivalent of clearing their throat. This was deeply sobering to everyone and deeply motivating to Vale, for whom confirmed that everything they had ever studied about communication was true, and at the core of it, the other thing is a time, and you must find your way into that time, was as applicable here at the edge of the universe as it had been in the deep-pressure oceans of the Ossiari home world, where two individuals might spend an entire season building toward a single exchange. They stayed at 200,000 kilometers for 6 months. During this time, 3 things happened that would, later, be identified as the 3 most significant events of the mission. The first was Davida's discovery about the nature of the being's biology. He had been working for all 6 months at the new position and for the 3 weeks of transit before it, on the question of what exactly the being was made of, not in the chemical sense, but in the organizational sense. How was its biology structured? What was the principle by which its molecular-level organization maintained itself and performed the functions that all biology must perform? Energy acquisition, maintenance, repair, response to environment. The probe data had been sufficient to identify the existence of the organization, but not to explain its mechanism. The unbroken theorem's more sophisticated sensor suite was providing better data, and David had been feeding it into his models with the patient, methodical attention of someone who had built a career on being thorough. What he found was this: the being's biological organization did not use chemistry the way every other known biology did. Every known biology, across all 1,700 species David had studied, across every environment, every atmospheric chemistry, every temperature range that had ever produced life, used molecular bonds as a fundamental unit of biological structure. Molecules bonded together in specific patterns to form larger structures, which in turn bonded in specific patterns to form the cellular or subcellular units of biological function. The bonds were the hinges of life. The being did not use bonds this way. Its molecular organization was maintained not by conventional chemical bonds, but by something that Davida's sensor analysis identified, after considerable mathematical work, as quantum entanglement at the macroscopic scale. The molecules in the being's biological substrate were linked not by shared electrons, the conventional mechanism of chemical bonding, but by quantum entanglement relationships that spanned distances from the microscopic to the massive. Individual molecules were entangled with other individual molecules across distances of meters, kilometers, thousands of kilometers. The entire being was a single, continuous quantum entangled system, every part of it in instantaneous, non-local communication with every other part, regardless of physical distance. This was what allowed it to function as a coherent biological entity at the scale of a moon, not a distributed colony, not an aggregate, but a single integrated organism, without any of the communication infrastructure that macroscopic biology normally required. Every part of it was, in some fundamental sense, every other part of it simultaneously. The implications of this for the question of its age were staggering. Quantum entanglement, under normal circumstances, was fragile. It collapsed rapidly in the presence of environmental noise. An entangled system of this complexity should have decoherence timescales measured in nanoseconds. The fact that this system had maintained coherence for 23 billion years minimum implied either a physical property of quantum entanglement that current physics had not discovered, or a mechanism within the being itself for continuously refreshing and maintaining its entangled state, a kind of ongoing biological coherence maintenance operating at a depth of physics that life, as currently understood, had no business operating at. David presented this in the joint analysis session at the end of the third month with the specific, terrified wonder of someone who has spent their entire career learning to see and has just discovered that everything they have seen so far has been 1% of the picture. The second significant event was Palavar's long conversation with Vail. It was not a conversation about science. It was a conversation about what the Devesi contemplative tradition had to say about the experience of being in the presence of something so old that age itself became a different concept. The Devesi had a word for this, Torval, which translated roughly as the vertigo of deep time. The word described a specific cognitive and emotional state of realizing, not just intellectually but in some full body, full being sense that time extended backward into depths so vast that everything you had ever experienced, your whole life, the whole history of your species, the whole history of the galaxy, was not even a thin film on the surface of it. The contemplative tradition had exercises for moving through Torval without being permanently disoriented by it. The exercises were practical, grounded, and Palavar said in a quiet, deliberate way he said everything relevant. Vail listened with the concentrated attention that the Asiari gave to things they were learning, which looked from the outside like absolute stillness. When Palavar finished, Vail asked one question. Did the tradition have anything to say about communicating within Torval? Not about surviving the vertigo, but about reaching through it, about finding the thread of connection between a being whose time was your whole universe and a being whose time was an impossible, uncountable vastness of something else? Palavar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, yes, there was a specific practice used by the most advanced contemplatives in the Devesi tradition for what they called speaking to the depth. It was not a linguistic technique. It was an attentional one. It required a practitioner to relinquish, as fully as possible, the assumption that the thing they were trying to reach was on a similar temporal scale to themselves, and to instead approach with what the tradition called empty time, a kind of radical temporal humility in which you release your own experience of duration and simply offered your presence, without urgency, without expectation of response on any timeline you could comfortably contemplate. Vail said, that is exactly what I've been trying to describe mathematically for the past 6 months, and I've been failing to describe it, and you have just given me the better language for it. After this conversation, Vail's approach to developing the contact protocol changed in ways that were subtle but, later, clearly significant. The third significant event was the night. If night meant anything, in deep space beyond any star, when Renya woke the entire crew at what the ship's chronometer registered as 0300 Standard Time and called everyone to the observation ring. The signal had changed again, not slightly, as it had when they first moved to 200,000 kilometers. Dramatically, the quantum vacuum fluctuation pattern had reorganized itself completely, shedding the structure it had held for the previous 3 months and adopting something new, something much more complex, much more dense in information, much more varied in its cycling period and harmonic relationships. The new signal was not one pattern, but dozens of patterns, interlocking, shifting against each other in relationships that Vail, standing at the signal analysis console and watching the data come in with an expression that would have read, in Asiari body language, as the equivalent of every sense being fully, completely, almost overwhelmingly awake, described as it is telling us something. It's not acknowledging us anymore. It is saying something. I don't know it yet, but it is saying it. The new signal pattern lasted for 11 days, and then subsided back to the baseline acknowledgement pattern. In those 11 days, Renya recorded more data than the probe had gathered in 6 months. Vail did not sleep. Asiari sleep patterns were flexible in the way of a species evolved for endurance, and in moments of deep necessity, they could go weeks on minimal rest, and spent all 11 days building a preliminary grammar of the new signal, trying to find the joints and seams of it, the places where one unit of meaning gave way to the next. When the signal subsided, Vail called a meeting and said, I need 6 months to analyze this. We should move closer while I work, not to provoke a response, just to improve our sense of resolution on the baseline signal. I want to hear everything the ongoing pattern contains. And when I built the grammar, we'll know how to answer. They moved to 50,000 kilometers over the following 2 months, in stages slow enough to allow continuous sensor calibration. At 50,000 kilometers, the being was not something you could see in the conventional sense. It was too large for the forward array to capture more than a fraction of it, and what fraction it captured was more context and overview, more detail than scope. The surface filled the array like a vast, slow landscape viewed from very low altitude. Channels of light, fields of moving biological material, the enormous structural formations rising and falling over their decades-long cycles, and over everything the slow, rhythmic pulses that David had come to think of as the being's breathing, though he used that word only in his private notes and not in official reports because the word was metaphorical and he was a scientist. At 50,000 kilometers, the quantum vacuum signal was extraordinarily clear. Renya sensor arrays were, at this range, able to resolve details in the fluctuation patterns that had been noised at the greater distances, and the resolution revealed things that transformed Vale's grammatical analysis. The signal was not a single stream of meaning, but a complex, multi-layered structure, simultaneously organized at several different scales, each scale communicating different things in different ways. The largest scale patterns, the ones with cycling periods of years, were what Vale had initially identified as the primary signal. But the signal was also organized at intermediate scales, with cycling periods of days and weeks, and at the smallest scale, with cycling periods of hours, there was a layer of signal that Vale identified, after 3 weeks of analysis, as something structurally analogous to what a mathematician would call indexing, a system for pointing at things, for saying this refers to that, for providing the connective tissue of reference that made complex meaning possible. The indexing layer was a breakthrough. Once Vale had the indexing layer mapped, the grammar of the signal became approachable in the same way that a language becomes approachable once you understand how its pronouns and demonstratives work. You still don't know all the words, but you know the shape of meaning. It took Vale 9 months to build the preliminary grammar, then another 4 to test it against all the data and confirm that it held, then 2 more to prepare the contact protocol, the plan for what they were going to say in this language of structured nothingness, this grammar of quantum void. 15 months after arriving at 50,000 kilometers, Vale called a meeting and said, "I'm ready to try." The contact protocol had 5 stages, each one carefully designed, and each one representing a different level of communicative risk. The first stage was the simplest and the safest. A mirror. Vale would reproduce the acknowledgement signal that the being had been emitting since they first moved to 200,000 kilometers, reproduce it as exactly as possible, using the ship's experimental quantum vacuum modulation system that Renya had spent the 15 months adapting for this purpose, and transmit it back toward the being, not as a message, exactly, as a demonstration of comprehension, as a way of saying, in the being's own language, "We have heard you. We know you are there. We are using your own signal to show you that we have learned something of how you speak." The mirror had to be exact. Anything less than exact would be noise. And exact. When you were working with quantum vacuum fluctuation patterns of this complexity, at this range, through the quantum modulation system that Renya had built from components designed for something entirely else, exact was an aspiration rather than a certainty. Renya had spent most of the 15 months making the system as close to exact as was physically possible, and she had achieved something she thought of as close enough to hope for a response. The second stage would come only if the first produced a clear response, a counter mirror, in which Vale would modify the mirrored signal slightly, adding a single new element not present in the original, to demonstrate not just comprehension but the capacity for generative response. Not just "I heard you," but "I heard you, and I can extend what you said." The third stage, if the second produced a response, a direct query, using the grammar Vale had built, asking the simplest possible question that the grammar could accommodate. Not "what are you" or "how old are you," or any of the urgent, burning questions that all 6 of them carried. Just, "Are you aware of us?" A question that offered the being the opportunity to confirm that the contact was mutual, that it was not simply broadcasting into the void, but attending to what the void contained. The 4th stage was for the being to determine, not the mission. The 4th stage was whatever the being chose to say. The 5th stage The final stage of the protocol was the one Vale described last and quietly, and with an emphasis that made clear it was both the most important and the one requiring the most care. The fifth stage was simply to listen for as long as necessary, with the full patience of empty time, to whatever the being said in response to being heard. Palavar, when Vale described the fifth stage, said one thing, vorimidal, and then said nothing more. But the iridescent sheen of his carapace pulsed with that same unnamed light it had shown when they first saw the being, the light that had no name because it had never been needed before. Stage 1 of the contact protocol was initiated on a day that none of them had planned to be significant, which was perhaps fitting for a conversation whose entire logic was the relinquishment of expectation about timing. Renya activated the quantum vacuum modulation system at 0900 standard time. The mirror signal went out. The system confirmed transmission. They waited. The signal went toward the being at the speed of light, which meant it reached the being's outer gradation zone in approximately a sixth of a second and the main body in approximately a quarter of a second, if the being responded immediately. And here, immediately was a relative term that had to be translated into the being's temporal framework, which meant immediately could still mean years. They would receive a response quickly. If the being processed a signal at the same rate it had been cycling through its own patterns, a response might not arrive for several years. They waited for 2 months, which was the minimum period Vale had specified as a threshold for deciding that no response was forthcoming, and that stage 1 needed to be refined before reinitiating. The response arrived in 43 days. It was not the acknowledgement signal returned to them, as they had sent. It was something new, a signal that used the indexing layer Vale had mapped, used it precisely and correctly, in a way that indicated the indexing layer had been understood, and added to the mirrored signal a set of additional elements that Vale spent 4 sleepless days analyzing before looking up from the data console with an expression that even Renya, who had known Vale for only a few years, could have read clearly enough. It answered, Vale said. It heard the mirror and it answered. It used the grammar we identified, not the grammar we transmitted. It used elements of the signal structure that we hadn't sent back, that it knew we had mapped because of how we constructed the mirror. It understood not just what we said, but what the fact of our saying it implied about what we knew. A pause, and then, more quietly, it is very intelligent. Stage 2 was superfluous. The being had already done Stage 2 for them. Stage 3, the direct query, was prepared over the following 3 weeks with exquisite care. Vale worked with Palavar, with Renya, with Sketh, with all of them, to make sure the query was as precise as possible. The question, "Are you aware of us?" was translated into grammatical structure Vale had mapped, verified by Renya's pattern analysis against all the known signal data, and then Vale sat with it for several additional days before transmitting, doing what the Asiari did when preparing to say something for which there might be only one opportunity, holding it in what Vale's species called the pre-speech, the space of fully formed meaning that existed before the decision to release it into the world. The query was transmitted. 29 days later, the response came. It was brief, by the standards of the signal, extremely brief, a tight cluster of structured fluctuations that resolved, under Vale's grammatical analysis, into something that could be rendered in words, though the rendering was approximate and imperfect in the way that all translations were, and infinitely more so when the source language was structured nothingness and the target language was any spoken tongue. I have been aware of you since you arrived. I have been aware of this region since before the current arrangement of matter began. This statement took some time to absorb. They absorbed it, the 6 of them, in the observation ring of the unbroken theorem. 50,000 kilometers from the oldest living thing in the universe, absorbing the fact that it had just, for the first time in what might be an eternity of silence, spoken. What it had sat in the air of the ring. They had all gathered together, not in their separate pods and quarters, but together in the shared air, and it was Davith who finally broke the silence, with a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite a sob, and in Torvalian body language meant something like the universe has just shown me that it is larger than I thought, again, for what I hope is not the last time. Vasirindal looked at Vale and said, "Ask what you need to ask." Vale said, "I need to do this in stages. I need to build a conversation slowly, carefully, because the grammar is not fully understood yet, and the risk of misrepresentation is high. And I need to ask the right questions in the right order." A pause. "But Yes, we are in the fourth stage now. The fourth stage belongs to it. We listen, and Vale, following the protocol, sent the signal that stage four required. Not a question, not a mirror, but the simplest signal the grammar could produce, the indexing layer equivalent of an open hand, the grammatical structure that meant, as precisely as possible in this language built from structured nothingness. We are here. We are listening. We are ready. What followed was not a conversation, in any conventional sense. It was something more like the slow unfolding of a document that had been folded for a very long time. The being's responses came at irregular intervals, each one requiring Vale and the team to spend weeks and sometimes months on analysis before the next query was prepared. And the being's signals, as they grew longer and more complex, began to exceed the grammar Vale had mapped and required the grammar to be extended, incrementally, carefully, with each new transmission providing new data for the structural models. They remained at 50,000 kilometers for 4 years. During those 4 years, the being said many things. Not quickly. Nothing in this conversation happened quickly, but clearly, with an extraordinary precision that Vale noted with professional admiration once the grammar became sufficient to appreciate it. The being communicated in a way that was utterly unmetaphorical. Its signal structures refer to things directly, without the layering of analogy and implication that most languages used. This was, Vale thought, perhaps a property of extreme age, a being that had existed for long enough to need no shortcuts, no approximations, no poetic compressions. It said what it meant exactly, and left no room for misinterpretation that could be avoided. In the first year of the conversation, what it said was primarily this: I am here. I have been here. The region of space you occupy was, before the current arrangement began, different in ways I can describe, but that your instruments cannot currently measure. I have observed the current arrangement from the beginning. I have observed several previous arrangements. Several, the word, in the grammatical structure Vale had built, referred to a quantity of indeterminate but substantial size. When Vale asked for elaboration, the response indicated 7. It had observed 7 previous universal arrangements. It had survived and observed 7 cosmological deaths and rebirths. The current universe was, from its perspective, the 8th. This information arrived in the signal on a quiet day in the second year of the conversation, and Sketh, processing it, went completely still for several hours. Then Sketh's outer membrane lit with rapid, complex luminescent patterns that in Vari body language indicated the equivalent of a mathematician who has just watched a proof they spent a lifetime working on collapse gracefully into a solution they never anticipated. 7 previous universes. 7 previous arrangements of space and matter and energy, and 1 continuous biological entity, quantum coherent across the entirety of each one, surviving each reset in some way that the current physics of the 8th universe could not fully describe. Sketh spent 6 months revising the theoretical framework before producing a paper that would, much later, be described as the most important work of cosmological mathematics in the history of any species. A paper whose central claim was that the cosmological reset events that separated one universal arrangement from the next were not true thermodynamic death, but a specific class of topological transformation in the quantum structure of space itself, a transformation during which the entanglement substrate of the being non-local by nature, persisted in what the paper carefully called topological invariance across reset, unchanged, continuous, immortal not because it had escaped death, but because it was organized at a level of physical reality that the reset did not touch. Sketh sent the paper to the Institute without expecting them to accept it, because it required accepting that the being existed, which required accepting all the implications of that, which the Institute had not fully managed yet. The Institute took 9 months to respond and then asked for additional supporting data, which Sketh provided without comment. In the second year of the conversation, what the being said began to expand in scope. It talked. And here talked is a word being stretched to cover a process that involved months of signal transmission analyzed over further months by a team of 6 exhausted and increasingly transformed scientists. But talked is the best word about the previous arrangements. Not in detail, not with the kind of narrative richness that would satisfy every burning question they wanted to ask. It described the previous universes the way an ancient traveler might describe a road taken long ago, accurately but without elaborating on every stone, but with enough specificity to make clear that the previous arrangements had been, in some cases, radically different from the current one in their fundamental physical properties, their constants, their topologies. In some of them, chemistry as the current universe understood it had not existed. In one of them, time itself had operated bidirectionally in a way the current universe did not permit. In two of them, the being had not been alone. That last detail arrived in a signal that Vail had to reconstruct 3 separate times before accepting the reading, because the grammatical construction was complex, and the implications of misreading it were too significant to risk. But the reading was consistent. In 2 of the previous arrangements, there had been others like it. 2 previous universes had contained more than one being of its kind. In both cases, those others had not survived the reset. It was the only survivor of its kind across 8 universal lifetimes. The understanding of this settled over the unbroken theorem with the weight of something that could not be quantified. Davith, reading the analysis, went to his cabin and was not seen for several hours. Vasirindal found him there, eventually, and did not ask what he was experiencing, but simply stayed nearby, which was a thing that needed to be done. Palavar, reading the same analysis, retreated to his meditative posture and did not emerge from it until following day, and when he emerged, his carapace had taken on a color that no member of the team had seen before, a deep, still, almost colorless color that was a Devesi expression of something beyond grief and beyond awe, a recognition of a magnitude of aloneness that no amount of contemplative preparation could fully ready a person for. They were the first things that had spoken to him longer than the current universe had existed. They sat with this for a long time. In the 3rd year of the conversation, Vail asked the question that they had all, in different ways, been moving toward from the beginning. What did it want? Not what was it. That question had been at least partially addressed. Not what had it seen. That question could be asked for centuries and not exhausted. But what did it want? Was there anything it sought from this contact? Was there anything it needed or desired or hoped for? The question was difficult to frame precisely in the grammar, and Vail spent 3 months working on the framing before transmitting. The response came 14 weeks later, and it was the longest single signal the being had transmitted in the 4 years of the conversation. A complex, multi-layered structure that took Vail and Renya working together, with occasional contributions from all the others, nearly 8 months to fully resolve. What it said was this: in the 7th arrangement, before the last reset, I developed what in your grammatical structure would be called an intention. The intention was to preserve something across the reset, to carry into the next arrangement some record of what had existed in the previous one. I understood by the 7th arrangement that each reset erased everything, not merely biological life, not merely complex structures, but every pattern and configuration that the arrangement had produced, every contingency of matter and energy, every unique form that the specific constants and topologies of that particular universe had made possible. Each arrangement was, in itself, an irreplaceable thing that the reset destroyed completely. I wished to preserve something. I wished to be a record. I have been a record. My biological structure, the substrate-level organization that your instrument operators have studied, is not merely a survival mechanism. It is a library. The entangled substrate of my body contains encoded information, patterns representing structures, configurations, forms, complexities that existed in previous arrangements and no longer exist anywhere else. I carry the record of 7 previous universes inside me. I am the only place where they still exist. Your question asks what I want. I do not have want in the form you might expect. I have existed long enough that the concept of wanting changes. But I have noticed, since the current arrangement reached a stage of sufficient complexity to produce beings capable of receiving a signal, that the library I carry has no reader. I have preserved this information across 7 deaths and 1 birth, and it has not been read. I am large enough and old enough that the question of whether anyone will ever read it is not urgent for me. I have learned patience at scales you have not yet encountered. But I have also noticed that you are here, and that you have come to listen. I am not sure what I want. But I believe that the fact of someone listening, the fact that what I carry can be heard, is something I have been waiting for a very long time. The night this translation was confirmed by Vail and independently verified by Renya, and cross-checked by all the others, and then confirmed again because none of them were willing to let it stand on a single reading. The unbroken theorem was very quiet. They had found, at the edge of the universe, the oldest living thing in existence, a being that had outlived not one universe, but 7, a being that was, in the deepest biological and structural sense, a library of everything that had ever been, in every iteration of the cosmos, a library with one reader, written in a language that existed in the quantum structure of the vacuum and the entangled substrate of the only biological entity in known existence that had ever operated at that level of physics. And it had been waiting to be read. Palavar was the one who said it. Eventually, in the quiet of the observation ring, with all 6 of them gathered together as they had been when the first contact signal arrived, in the shared air, looking at the vast, slow landscape of the being filling the forward array with its patient, ancient light. We were not sent here to study it. We were sent here to find it, and it was waiting here to be found. Vale said, "It's not the same thing." "No," Palavar agreed. "It's not." Davis said, after a long time, "The library. We need to understand that it said the library can be heard. We need to understand what hearing it means, what reading it means, whether we are capable of it." "We are not capable of it," Sketh said, the luminescent pulses moving through the Vari's membrane in a complex pattern that meant something like, "And this is not a failure but an orientation point. Not now, not with what we currently are. The encoded information in its structure is at a level of physical organization that our entire civilization does not have the tools to interact with. This is a generational project. This is a civilization project. This might be the longest project any species has ever undertaken." Vasirindal said, "Then we start." Before they started, before the mission transitioned from the phase of contact into the phase of the long work, the phase that would outlast all 6 of them and most of the institutions that had sent them and possibly several iterations of the science needed to make progress on it, Vale had one more exchange with the being, not an official stage of the protocol, not a carefully prepared query, triple-checked against a grammatical model, just a transmission, simple and personal, in the clearest signal construction Vale could produce in the being's own language. "We hear you. We are not able to read the full library yet. We will work toward it. It may take a very long time." The response came back in 9 days. It was the shortest signal the being had ever sent. In Vale's grammar, it resolved to 3 elements, a temporal reference, an affirming structure, and what could only be rendered as. "I know." In the years that followed the mission's official conclusion, the unbroken theorem returned to Institute Space 14 months after the final contact exchange, carrying data volumes that required 17 new theoretical frameworks and took 80 years of subsequent scholarship to begin to properly analyze. The story of the 6 scientists and the being at the edge of the universe became one of those events in the history of civilization that reshaped everything downstream of it. The way a large boulder dropped into a river reshapes the water's path for years in every direction. The Galactic Institute of Ancient Studies was reconstituted as a Galactic Institute of Deep Time Studies, with a budget 30 times its previous size and a mandate that had previously been unthinkable. The development, over however many centuries it required, of the technological and theoretical capacity to read the library, to hear the full record of 7 previous universes, carried in the body of the one being that had survived them all. Sketh's cosmological mathematics paper was eventually accepted and generated a field of study that had produced, by the time of Sketh's death several decades after the mission, more significant theoretical work than any comparable framework in the history of Vari scholarship. The central insight that the being's survival was not biological miracle but topological invariance, that existed at a level of physical reality that cosmological resets did not reach, was eventually confirmed by independent theoretical analysis from 4 other species, and became the foundation for what became known as the Deep Physics Research Program, one of the most ambitious scientific projects in interstellar history. Davitta's work on substrate-level biological organization sparked an entire subfield of exobiology, focused on life organized below the cellular threshold. No other examples of such life were ever found. The being remained the only known instance, but the theoretical framework proved applicable to a range of extreme environments and edge case biology that enriched the understanding of life's possible forms across the known galaxy in ways that continue producing scholarship long after David was gone. Renya's quantum vacuum modulation system, refined after mission and published as an open framework, became a standard tool in deep space research, primarily for purposes entirely unrelated to interentity communication, though the irony of its origin was noted and celebrated. Palavar returned to the Devesi Cultural Compact and spent the rest of his long life revising contemplative literature, incorporating into the old frameworks of Vorimidal and speaking to the depth of lived experience of having actually done both. The revised literature was broader and quieter than the original, and subsequent generations of Devesi contemplatives found it more useful. He never fully stopped thinking about the being, he said once near the end of his life, to a student who asked what the experience had changed in him. I thought I understood patience. I had studied patience all my life, and then I spent 4 years in conversation with something that had waited 23 billion years for someone to listen, and I understood that everything I knew about patience was the very first page of a book I had not yet opened. Vasirindal wrote the mission report, and then wrote a second document, personal rather than official, that she sent to the Institute's archive with instructions that it be held in the private collection rather than the public one. The document was simply her own account of what it felt like, from beginning to end, not the science, not the data, not the professional analysis, but the experience of being a living, mortal, time-limited being in the presence of something that had outlasted everything. It was not a document she expected anyone to need. She wrote it because she needed the writing of it, because there are events in a life that require a private record to be real, and this was the largest of hers. The document was eventually released decades after her death, as part of a general archive declassification, and was read by more people than any of the scientific papers the mission produced. This surprised no one who had read it, and Vale returned to the Osiari homeworld briefly, and then returned to work, because the work was not finished, not even close to finished, and the Osiari commitment to the unrelinquishable effort connection was not a thing that ended when the immediate task was done. Vale spent the following decades working on the theoretical foundation of what would eventually become the Reading Project, the multi-generational, multi-species effort to develop the tools and frameworks needed to access the information encoded in the being's quantum entanglement substrate. Vale did not live to see significant progress on the Reading Project, because the progress was slow and the project was large, and the Osiari were long-lived but not infinite. What Vale did see before the end was a beginning. The first generation of deep physics researchers trained on the new frameworks, the first quantum substrate imaging tools built on principles derived from the mission data, the first tentative attempts to resolve structure in the encoded information that would prove, eventually, to be the most patient and deliberate piece of decoding any civilization had ever undertaken. Whether it was finished, whether the library was ever read, in any meaningful sense, depended on how long you were willing to wait. The being, for its part, was waiting. It was very good at waiting. At 50,000 kilometers, the unbroken theorem had been replaced by a permanent research station, a much larger installation, built and staffed by the Institute and maintained by an interstellar consortium that had formed specifically around the mission's implications. And the being's quantum vacuum signal continued, as it had continued for the entire 6 months of the probe's tenure and the years of the mission, and the decades after, slow and regular and structured, the deep patient rhythm of something that had been saying, I am here for longer than the universe had known how to answer. Occasionally, the research station sent it a signal. Nothing elaborate, just the acknowledgement mirror, the simplest construction in the grammar, the one that meant we hear you, regularly, like a heartbeat, like the rhythm of a species that had decided it was going to keep returning to this conversation until it had learned everything there was to learn. The being always responded. It was very old. It was not any longer alone. The edge of the universe was quiet, in the way that deep things are quiet. Not empty, not absent, but full of a kind of stillness that was not the stillness of nothing, but the stillness of something that has been waiting for so long that waiting itself had become a form of life. The being moved, slowly. Its surface caught its own light and held it. Its structural formations rose and fell on their decades-long rhythms. Its channel networks pulsed, and the pulses traveled to the organized quantum-entangled substrate that contained, in configurations of extraordinary complexity and beauty, the record of everything that had ever been. It was, at last, being read. Not completely. Not yet. The reading was young, in the only scale that mattered here, and the library was vast, and the readers were small and short-lived by comparison. But they came back. Generation after generation. They came back. They built better tools. They asked better questions. They carried the work forward, slowly, with a kind of patience that is not passivity, but is instead the deepest form of attention. The kind that says, this is where the full length of everything we have, and we will give it. The being pulsed its ancient light into the dark beyond the edge of the known. The research station pulsed back, and the conversation continued. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.